What's the most terrifying secret you've seen in real life? Story 1. Not sure whether this makes me fortunate or unfortunate, but the most horrifying thing I've ever seen is completely imaginary. I was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia at 14, although I first started showing early signs at 7. I hallucinate constantly, both visually and audibly, and my visual hallucinations can cause me pain. I assume they could also cause pleasant sensations from touch, but I've yet to experience that. The entire manifestation of my condition seems intent on making me as miserable as possible, almost like another entity in my head. Most of my visual hallucinations appear as human-like figures, entirely black and lacking any real defining features. They don't resemble anyone I know, as far as I can tell. However, they seem to enjoy making me as uncomfortable as possible by just leering endlessly. They're always there, usually just watching me. It feels like I'm being judged constantly on every movement, every action. Over the years, it has made me incredibly self-conscious. Anyway, I was sitting in my room at the age of 15. It was late at night, and my family had been asleep for hours. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud behind me. I had been hallucinating for years at this point, so I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just another fake bump in the night. Then I felt a hand over my mouth, followed by a swift, sharp, agonizing pain in my ribs. To this day, I consider it the most painful thing I've ever felt. The hand left my face, and my head collapsed onto my laptop. I grabbed my side, which felt warm and wet. I saw a shadow slip out my bedroom door as my vision blurred, and the room started spinning. For a full 20 minutes, I could not move. The pain was overwhelming and my body was going into shock. I managed to glance down at my side, where I appeared to be bleeding heavily. I could feel the blood running down my body, hear it dripping onto the carpet. My mind raced with thoughts of my family being in danger. I heard my dogs barking wildly, unable to reach the intruder because we had installed a door at the end of the hallway to give the cats some peace. My heart pounded so loudly it was unbearable. I heard screaming, voices telling me how much of a failure I was, that I was a complete idiot, that it was all my fault. Tears streamed down my face, and finally, I let out a scream. A few moments later, my sister opened my door, turned on the light, and the nightmare vanished. The pain in my ribs dulled significantly but still burned. I lifted my head from my keyboard, and the pool of blood beneath me was gone. I pulled my hands from my side, and they were suddenly clean and dry. My sister looked at me with concern, asking what was wrong, wondering why I was sobbing and screaming at 2 a.m. I cried even harder, and all I could say was, "I'm just insane." That was the night I realized I would have to deal with this for the rest of my life. That I would experience traumas and stresses that never existed, that I would constantly question the motives and intentions of every single person, relative or stranger. But in the end, at least most of my fears and worries turn out to be illusions. Story 2. When I was younger, I kicked a ball over the fence at my dad's friend's house. Naturally, I stepped onto the fence and poked my head over to see how far it had gone. I saw a man a decent distance away in the backyard, so I called out, asking if he could pass my ball back over. He didn't respond. Confused, I asked my sister if I was seeing things right. She looked and thought it was a scarecrow. I went to tell my dad and his friend, and they looked over, calling out. But still, nothing. They decided to jump the fence to check it out. That's when we realized I had been calling out to a man who had taken his own life. I had been asking him to pass my ball back over. A few minutes later, the police arrived. That's about all there is to the story. It wasn't really scary, just unsettling. I was pretty young, but it didn't really get to me at the time. I still remember it clearly, though. Story 3. A hand grenade flying through the passenger side window of my Humvee. I was already on edge to begin with, but that was, without a doubt, the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced. The second most terrifying thing was the aftermath of that grenade. I lost a hand, broke both legs, and part of my foot was gone. Guess what I didn't lose? Consciousness. After seeing my missing hand and my mangled legs, I struggled to stay with it. I remember how my brain, or maybe my body, started making me feel like dying was okay. It was a dreamy, peaceful sensation, and that scared me the most. Story 4. I worked as a healthcare security officer in a large locked psychiatric ward. One day as I was leaving dispatch, I happened to glance at one of our old black and white monitors. A man was sitting in the middle of the main floor. Something about it felt off. Then I saw a dark puddle forming beneath him. I immediately ran up to the unit, and there he was, sitting in a pool of blood. I called for backup, but before I could react further, he stood up and charged at me. I fought this guy for about 5 minutes. Both of us were covered in blood. His eyes were empty, cold like a shark's. Turns out he had sat on the floor and ripped out the stitches the ER had put in after a previous suicide attempt. Story 5. My friend had an aneurysm while using the bathroom. He had just smoked weed, and his wife ran to my house next door to get me and another friend for help. She refused to call 911 because the house smelled like pot. When I got there, I found him collapsed on the bathroom floor, pants still down. I screamed at her that she needed to call for help immediately. My friend and I dragged him out of the bathroom, shoved some ice down his pants, and I began CPR. The first responders arrived in this order: EMTs, then the cops, then the fire department. He wouldn't wake up, but he still had a pulse. I had hope. A little later, I found out it had been an aneurysm. He was already brain dead when I was giving him CPR. His wife kept him on life support for months, praying for a miracle. Eventually, they had to let him go. But by then, I had transferred to another university and only heard about it third or fourth hand. Story 6. When I was 17, I still lived at my mom's house. We were in a middle-class neighborhood. Decent area for the most part. One evening, just as the sun had set, I was taking out the garbage. As I walked the first trash can to the curb, I noticed two men arguing across the street. I went back for the second can, and as I turned around, one of the men suddenly pulled out a gun and shot the other point blank in the head. Then he turned and looked directly at me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he turned and ran. I stayed surprisingly calm until I got on the phone with the police. That's when I started freaking out and panicking. As far as I know, they never caught him. Story 7. Mine wasn't so much about seeing something as it was about experiencing it. When I was 11, my dad took his own life, and I had absolutely no way of processing it. When I was told the news, I didn't even react. I just sat there quietly because my brain couldn't comprehend the idea that the man who was my best friend had chosen to leave me behind. I made up all sorts of excuses in my head about what had really happened, the most realistic being that he had faked his own death and was just trying to get away from everything. Even his funeral didn't mean much to me, as he was cremated, which only reinforced my belief that he was still alive somewhere. It took me about 3 to 4 years to truly understand everything, to have it finally click in my mind. I started noticing all the strange details I hadn't realized when I was younger. Things like the time I came downstairs and found him sobbing for no reason, or the looks of devastation on his face even while we were having fun at an amusement park. The final piece was his suicide note, which I wasn't told about until years later. In it, he wrote that my sister and I were his entire world, that he wished he could stay and watch us grow up, but that life had simply become too much for him. I later learned that he was severely bipolar, which explained the fits of rage followed by deep sadness that I had always assumed were just part of his personality. After that realization, I became terrified that I would end up like him. And to this day, I still get scared every time I feel too angry or too sad. It wasn't something immediate, something you could just see and look away from. It was the slow, dawning realization that my best friend had been so mentally ill that he couldn't stand to stay alive. And that is the scariest thing I could ever possibly imagine. Story 8. I had just left the mall after seeing a movie with my 2 teenage sons. We had arrived separately and parked in different sections of the lot. As I was driving up the parking ramp, I caught a glimpse of my son's car out of the corner of my eye. Its front end completely smashed in, smoke rising from the hood. My heart stopped. I immediately made a U-turn and raced toward them. As I got closer, I saw my older son, 17 years old, standing outside the passenger door, holding his 14-year-old brother in his arms. The passenger airbag had deployed, leaving a nasty scrape across my younger son's face, but thankfully, they were both okay. That moment, that sheer panic and helplessness as I drove toward them, was the worst fear I have ever felt, and I hope I never feel it again. Story 9. I was about 8 years old, out for a walk with my dad and our yellow lab. We had just started heading back home when, about halfway there, a bear appeared in the middle of the street. It stood on its hind legs, 12 feet tall, looking absolutely furious. My dad immediately put me behind his back. That's when we noticed a cub on the side of the road, and we both knew this bear wasn't playing. If it thought its cub was in danger, it was going to attack. Before we could even react, our dog suddenly charged at the bear, full speed. We watched in shock as she slammed into it and tackled it down the hill at the side of the road. My dad and I stood there, frozen, thinking that was the end of her. A minute later, we saw her trotting back up the hill, completely unharmed. She had just wrestled a bear all the way down the hill and won, and most likely, she had saved both of our lives. Story 10. Seeing someone get hit by a car. I was around 10 years old on my way to the doctor's office for a checkup when we stopped at a red light. To my left, a man was crossing the street. He looked down the road, hesitated for a moment, then started running across the crosswalk. The next thing I knew, a car sped through the light and slammed into him. His body launched into the air before crashing onto the pavement with a loud thud. He didn't move. He just lay there completely still. Luckily, we were just down the road from a hospital, and there was a cop right across the street. As we drove away, I caught a glimpse of the driver, a woman in absolute hysterics. The thing that stuck with me the most wasn't what I saw. It was the sound, the impact of the car hitting him, and the oomph he made when it did. Story 11. Catching a meth-addicted young woman rummaging through tools in my dad's garage. The moment she realized a larger man had confronted her in a confined space, her face twisted into pure terror. She was ready to claw my eyes out to survive what she most likely perceived as a threat. The second she turned to run, my dad, who was a police officer, caught her by the arm and held her down until the authorities arrived. She fought, begged, and pleaded with us, convinced that we were going to hurt her. She kept screaming that we would kidnap or assault her, even though all we were trying to do was get professionals to handle her drug-fueled breakdown. The struggle got so intense that we had no choice but to restrain her, to keep her from harming herself or us. Later, we found out that she had been on the run, convinced that people were after her. She had fled a hotel, thinking she was about to be kidnapped, and when she stumbled into our garage, we became her worst nightmare. In her mind, she was being kidnapped, and from the look in her eyes, she truly believed it. Story 12. When I was 15, I lived with my Vietnam veteran dad in East LA on a busy street where car crashes were common. It became routine. You hear screeching tires, a crunch, then you grab the cordless phone. This was 1995. Some towels, head outside, check on the people involved, and call 911. Most of the time, it was just shaken up drivers and dented cars. You help direct traffic, keep things calm, and wait for the cops. But one day the sound was different. We heard screeching tires, but instead of a crunch, there was a thud. That meant it wasn't a car, it was a person. We ran outside. 20 feet from the crosswalk, a woman lay sprawled on the asphalt. A few feet away at the curb, a baby stroller was tipped over, an infant lying on the pavement. This one was going to be bad. Without hesitation, my dad barked orders in the most direct, military tone I'd ever heard. Grab 2 towels, I'll cover the 2 bodies. I ran. When we got outside, the baby was crying, and I had never been so relieved to hear a sound in my life. An older woman rushed over and scooped the baby up from the gutter. My dad immediately started telling her not to move the child, but she cut him off. She had seen everything. The mother had been pushing the stroller across the street when she saw the car coming. With no time to react, she did the only thing she could. She pushed the stroller forward, out of the way, and took the full impact of the vehicle herself. The stroller rolled to the curb and tipped, tossing the baby onto the asphalt. We didn't know if the baby was okay to be picked up, but we had another problem. The mother. She was alive but badly hurt. Blood dripped from her mouth, her front teeth missing. Her knees and shins were so scraped up that bone was visible. Her arm looked broken. She was conscious but crying, and my dad immediately told her not to move. He barked at the bystanders to do the same. I was on the phone with 911, repeating everything he told me. Then her boyfriend arrived. A fully tattooed gang member, he came sprinting toward her, shoving people aside. He was crying, frantic. My dad stopped him, not with force, but with words. Instead of saying you can't, he said, hold her left hand. And just like that, the guy dropped to his knees and held her hand, whispering to her until the ambulance arrived. We never had to use the towels that day. We later heard that she had a broken arm and shoulder, but she and the baby were going to be fine. Years later, I moved into an apartment right on Sunset Boulevard, where car crashes became a regular sight again. I went through the same motions my dad had taught me. But one morning, a large pickup T-boned a sedan carrying 4 people. That day, I did have to use the towels. Story 13. When I was about 10 years old, I saw a man fall from a ladder and die. In Cincinnati, Ohio, some of the hills are ridiculously steep, and the buildings are tall to accommodate the terrain. The man had to be up at least 4 stories. maybe more. But I was young, so I can't say for sure. My half-sister, who is 13 years older than me, was driving, and I remember her crying her eyes out. I didn't fully understand what I had seen at the time. The man had been up on the ladder when there was a sudden flash. I later learned that he had hit a power line, and that's why his ladder shot out from under him. He plummeted straight down, landing in the street. I don't know if the electrocution killed him or if it was the impact from the fall, but either way, he never got back up. Story 14. I was one of the first people to arrive at the scene of a car crash that ended up killing 3 people. It was surreal. I was driving over a hill and didn't see the actual crash, but the dust was still settling. I pulled over and immediately ran down into the ditch where one of the cars had come to a stop. Both people in that car were okay, so I went back up to the road where the driver and passenger of the second car were crawling out of their windows. They looked like they were about 16. That's when I saw the 2 girls lying in the road. One was clearly gone. The other was gasping for air. Her lung collapsed, her body covered in compound fractures. She was bleeding badly, surrounded by people desperately trying to keep her awake until the EMTs arrived to intubate her. All of that was shocking, but the scariest part was the driver. I talked to him for a long time to try and keep him calm. At first, he spoke as if we had just met under normal circumstances. I asked his name, where he went to school, and he answered normally. But then, every few minutes, he would suddenly snap back into reality. His eyes would change, and he would start panicking. Then just as quickly, he'd slip right back into small talk like nothing had happened. I've seen people in shock before, but never like that. Story 15. I witnessed a friend die when I was a kid. I've posted this story on Reddit before, so forgive me if you've already seen it. My friends and I used to play by a creek near my cousin's house. Their backyard led straight into the woods, and the creek was about a mile deep behind their home. We played there pretty much every day during the summer. One of our favorite things to do was swing from one side of the creek to the other, using a makeshift rope swing we had built. We had done it 1,000 times. Sometimes we slipped, but the worst that ever happened was getting wet and having to go home to change. But one day was different. Josh, one of our friends, lost his grip. Normally, it would have been no big deal, just another fall into the creek. But this time he fell backward and hit his head directly on a cluster of large rocks at the edge of the water. The impact was brutal. Blood poured from his head and he wasn't moving. My brother immediately jumped in to keep him from drowning, while I, my cousin, and another friend sprinted back to my aunt's house to get help. My brother, my other cousin, and a friend stayed behind, trying to do something, anything to help. We got help as fast as we could, but it was already too late. It was a freak accident. We had fallen off that swing so many times without any issues, but that day Josh felt just wrong, and it cost him his life. I will never forget the sound of his parents screaming when they arrived. I could hear them from my aunt's backyard. It was awful. Even now, I can't watch movies where children die. And as a father myself, I can't imagine sending my kid out to play, only to be told they aren't coming home. That experience changed me. It didn't make me overprotective, though. It made me less protective. It made me realize that life is unpredictable and that accidents can happen anywhere. I refuse to let fear control me, but I will never forget what happened that day. This happened in 1995. For those too young to remember, this was before cell phones were common. I was 11 and all of us were between 11 and 13, so even if phones had been widespread, we wouldn't have had them. Having a phone wouldn't have saved Josh, but I figured I should explain why we had to run a mile to get help. Story 16. I worked at a gas station when I was 18. One night, at the end of my shift, the graveyard shift worker never showed up. I called my sister to come hang out with me while I tried to get a hold of someone. Around 4 in the morning, an ambulance slowed down right in front of the station. As it came to a stop at the light, the back doors suddenly swung open and a man jumped out. One of the paramedics leaped out after him, chasing him down. The guy ran straight toward the station, his face twisted in pure terror. As he turned to keep running, we saw the back of his head. There was a massive chunk missing, blood pouring down his back. The paramedic kept after him, chasing him into the parking lot next door. My sister and I immediately called 911 and reported what had just happened. The dispatcher's response, "Yeah, right." About 20 minutes later, the police finally arrived to take our statements. Apparently, the guy had been high and injured, trying to escape from the paramedics. I have no idea if they ever caught up with him again. Story 17. I watched my mother give my brother CPR on the beach after he broke his neck and nearly drowned. He had been underwater for about 4 minutes. Then I watched as the helicopter took him away, not knowing if he was dead or alive. He defied the odds and lived another 36 years as a quadriplegic. I was with him when he passed a few years ago. Damn, we had some good times. To answer a few questions, this happened in 1980 at Rehoboth Beach. There was a major storm or hurricane miles offshore, and the waves were rough. He was body surfing when a wave carried him too far and slammed him headfirst into the sand. Despite his injury, he went on to graduate high school, then college, and even attended some law school. Eventually, he pursued a career in social work and advocacy. He worked until about 40 and lived until he was 52. He had broken the same vertebra as Christopher Reeve, but was lucky enough to breathe on his own. Doctors told us not to expect him to live past his 20s, but he proved them wrong. Story 18. I saw a 5-year-old girl fall about 30 feet from a chairlift while skiing. I was only about 15 feet away when she hit the ground. She landed on her stomach. I called ski patrol immediately, but the minutes it took for them to get there felt like an eternity. It was probably no more than 5 minutes, but in that moment, it stretched on forever. I had no real medical training, just the basic do not move an injured person, but her face was directly in the snow. So, I took off my jacket, held her neck and head still, and had someone nearby slide my jacket underneath her face to keep her from breathing in the cold powder. It was just after Christmas, so I tried to distract her. I asked her what Santa had brought her, and when she mentioned a favorite gift, I started singing her favorite Christmas song. I kept holding her neck still until ski patrol arrived, stabilized her, and sent her off in the ambulance. Later, I found out she was incredibly lucky. Aside from some severe bruising, she was able to walk out of the ER that same day. Her parents were amazing. Even though it was the holidays, they contacted a therapist right away and made sure she got back on skis just a few days later, so she wouldn't grow up with a fear of skiing. About 5 years after that, I became a member of the National Ski Patrol, a volunteer organization that patrols smaller resorts. That moment stayed with me, and it shaped who I became. Story 19. I saw a car crash when I was a child. My dad stopped the car to help, making me stay inside while he ran toward the wreckage. Through the windshield, I could see everything. One body lay on the ground, a pool of blood slowly spreading around it. Another body hung halfway out of the window of one of the wrecked cars, unmoving. Blood, shattered glass, and chunks of twisted metal were everywhere. The air was filled with the relentless blaring of car horns and the sound of people screaming. My dad came back to the car not long after he had left, his face pale, his expression hollow. I asked him what had happened, and he just shook his head and said there was nothing he could do. He pulled into a parking lot, and we waited for the cops to arrive. You would think seeing the bodies would be what stuck with me the most, but it wasn't. It was the look on my dad's face when he came back to me. The empty, helpless expression of a man who had tried to do the right thing and realized it didn't matter. Sometimes, no matter how good your intentions are, there's nothing you can do, and I could tell that realization haunted him. Story 20. I made a throwaway account to share this because I don't want people close to me to see it and freak out. Normally, I only tell this story to people I trust, people who would understand. It wasn't just something I saw, it was something I experienced. I had an extremely abusive stepfather when I was young. He was great at first, but that changed after my 2 half-brothers, his biological children, were born. After that, it was like he saw me as a burden. Worse than that, he seemed to enjoy hurting me. He was a former boxer, physically strong, and I never stood a chance. From ages 8 to 15, I got beaten at least once a week. He even found ways to do it without leaving marks, like he had studied it. He'd force me onto the floor, put a baseball bat across my shins and stand on it, slowly rolling it back and forth. He enjoyed it. I could see it in his face. But it wasn't until I became a teenager that I realized he had other things in mind for me. He didn't start touching me until I was older, until he considered me physically attractive. I don't hate my mother because I know she was just as much a victim as I was. She convinced herself it wasn't happening, even minutes after it did. I watched her mind break, piece by piece, from the weight of it all. I wanted to call CPS, but he treated my half-brothers like royalty, and I didn't want to ruin their future for the sake of my own. In my mind, if I reported him, we'd all be taken away, and I couldn't do that to them. Then summer break came. For the first time, I was out of homeschooling and in a real high school which meant I was finally away from him during the day. I wasn't the weakest anymore. I was growing stronger, learning how to fight back. He was starting to realize I wasn't as easy to break as I used to be, and I think that frustrated him. But with summer break approaching, I knew things were about to get worse. I knew I had to do something, so I decided to fight. I reinstalled the door to my room, even though I couldn't find the knob, and shoved shoes under it to keep it from opening. I sat on the edge of my bed, gripping my own belt, folding it over in my hands as I waited for him to come home. He noticed the door immediately. He started screaming, banging against it like an animal. The shoes stopped it from swinging open, but he kept ramming into it, trying to force his way through. So I charged at him, swinging the metal end of the belt straight at his face. That was it. That was my line in the sand. It only took seconds for him to overpower me. He knocked the wind out of me, then started going for my face. I fought back harder than I ever had before. He wasn't expecting it. We wrestled, crashing into my dresser, knocking things over. I managed to get the belt around his neck, pulling as hard as I could. I dragged him across the floor, into the hallway, but I could only keep the grip as long as I was moving. He got free near the bathroom, and from there, everything went black. I woke up in total darkness. For a second, I thought I was blind. I started feeling around, panicked, trying to figure out where I was. Then I realized I was in the bathtub, covered in shards of glass. My stepfather had thrown me through the sliding glass shower doors. My body wouldn't work properly. I felt disoriented, dizzy. Something was wrong with my ear. It messed with my balance, making it hard to stand. When I finally managed to get up, I turned on the light and looked in the mirror. My face and chest were drenched in blood. My nose was broken. My teeth were chipped. My lip was split open so badly that I could see the fat underneath. I had no idea where my stepfather was. The bathroom was at the end of the hall, which meant I had to pass every single room to get out. I crept toward the door, listening, watching. My shirt was heavy with blood, and I had to keep one hand on the wall to keep from falling over. The house was silent. I peeked into every room as I passed. He wasn't there. Then I reached the kitchen. He was sitting on the counter, stripped down to his boxers, drinking tequila straight from the bottle. His clothes were stuffed inside a garbage bag on the floor. He had ripped the phone out of the wall and smashed it. Next to him, plugged into the wall, was a saw from the garage. I could see it had been tested once. He was staring at it, wide-eyed, his hands shaking. And then he saw me. The look on his face told me everything. He thought he had killed me. He had been seconds away from cutting my body into pieces, ready to make me disappear. I bolted for the door. He called after me, but he didn't chase me. It was broad daylight, and even though I was bleeding all over the street, no one was around to see me. I ran until I found a payphone at an AM/PM. An employee came outside asking if I needed help, if they should call the cops. I told them no. I called a teen crisis hotline instead. Long story short, I ended up in a youth shelter downtown. I chose to live as a runaway for the entire summer break and into the next school year. They got me medical care, food, a bed, things I had never really had before. It was the happiest time of my life, which is terrifying to admit. But that's how bad home was. I would rather be a homeless kid in a shelter than spend one more night under the same roof as him. Story 21. I had just turned 22 and was living in Austin at the time. My friends and I decided to go out on Lake Travis for my birthday weekend, so naturally, a few days before, we went to a strip club and invited some dancers and cocktail waitresses to come with us. Saturday arrived and we were out on the lake, drinking and having a good time. The only one who stayed sober the entire time was our driver. One of the girls had a little too much to drink and suddenly realized she had lost her phone. She started freaking out, demanding we take her back to the bar where we had lunch, or else she was going to jump off the boat. We tried to calm her down, reassuring her that we would go back and look for it, and if we didn't find it, we would all pitch in to get her a new one. But she wasn't listening. She kept trying to jump overboard. We restrained her, thinking we had the situation under control. 5 minutes later, she suddenly lunged forward and threw herself off the front of the boat, taking one of the guys with her, my best friend from high school, Nathan. And I knew immediately that this was going to be bad. Then we saw the water behind us turn red. The alcohol left our systems instantly. Nathan dove into the water while I threw the life ring, trying to pull them back as quickly as possible. Our driver, still completely sober, sprang into action as well. Out of the 14 people on that boat, only 3 of us reacted immediately. The rest, mostly the girls, were frozen in panic. When I pulled her back into the boat, the sight was horrifying. Chunks of flesh were missing, her back was torn open from heel to neck, and bone was exposed where the boat's propeller had chewed through her body. The guy who had gone overboard with her was somehow completely unharmed. The worst part for me was knowing that I had to apply pressure to her wounds. As we raced toward the nearest dock where paramedics could reach us, I sat at the back of the boat, pressing down on her torn-up back with everything I had. She screamed and begged me to stop, sobbing that I was hurting her, but I knew that if I let up for even a second, she wouldn't make it. I don't know how long I sat there, holding her together, but it felt like an eternity. The entire time I thought she was going to die, but she didn't. She survived. When we visited her in the hospital, the doctors told us that if any one of the three of us, Nathan, the driver, or me, hadn't kept our cool, she wouldn't have made it. Story 22. My family used to go camping in Ontario, Canada. When I was 16, I took our small 14-foot fishing boat out in the evening, planning to be back before dark, but I lost track of time. Then a massive storm rolled in. The waves grew to 4 feet, hail started pelting the water, and before I knew it, the boat was thrown into some rocks, capsizing and dumping me into a shallow cove on a large peninsula. I had no way of contacting anyone. Cell service was useless that far into the wilderness. So I flipped the boat over, built a small shelter, and prepared to hunker down for the night. Sometime during the night, I woke up to a sound I'll never forget. Howling, loud, eerie howling. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the tree line. That's when I saw it. A wolf standing maybe 20 feet away, its teeth bared, snarling at me. Panic hit instantly. I scrambled under the boat, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The wolf started circling, trying to get at me. Then it started digging. For the rest of the night, I used my fishing pole to swat at it anytime it got too close, trying to keep it from getting under the boat. Every time I thought it might leave, it would come back, pacing, watching, waiting for its chance. I've never been more terrified in my life. Nothing compares to looking into the eyes of a wild animal that sees you as food. Story 23. The worst day of my life was the day my wife gave birth to our daughter at only 19 weeks. Technically, it was a miscarriage. My wife's cervix wasn't strong enough, and something ruptured. At least that's what I think the doctor said. I stopped listening the moment I realized I wasn't going to be a dad anymore. My wife went through all the stages of labor for about 7 hours after that. 7 hours of knowing our baby wouldn't survive. When she was born, she weighed only 12 ounces. She was so tiny, but she was perfect. I held her, counted her fingers and toes, and watched her heart beating through her fragile chest. Then I watched it stop. I didn't want to let her go. As I held her, I gently pressed my hand against her tiny back, rhythmically, as if I could make her chest rise again, pretending, for just a moment, that she was still alive. I don't know why I did that. Maybe I wasn't ready to accept it. Maybe I thought if I kept moving her, she wouldn't really be gone. But she was. That was the worst day of my life. Nothing will ever come close. Story 24. 3 years ago, a friend and I were driving back from downtown, just chatting. He was behind the wheel, and I was in the passenger seat. I noticed something large lying in the street near the local drive-in theater. From a distance, it looked like an animal, maybe roadkill. But as we got closer, the shape grew bigger. When my friend drove past it, we realized it was a person. The man on the ground suddenly got up and stumbled toward us just as we slowed down to make a U-turn. As my friend turned the car around to help him, we heard a loud thud. I looked to my right, out the passenger window, and saw blood smeared all over the glass in the side mirror. My friend immediately hit the brakes. The man was banging on my window, pleading for help. He was a large man, and half of his jaw was missing. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. He had been shot in the face and chest, and it was clear that only adrenaline was keeping him alive. My friend was frozen in shock, but my own adrenaline took over. I didn't hesitate. I jumped out of the car to help him. My friend thought I was insane for getting out in such a dangerous area, covered in a stranger's blood. But I didn't care. He called 911 while I tried to keep the man calm, hoping to prevent him from injuring himself further. I kept asking what had happened, but all he could say was, "Help me, please. I'm dying." I grabbed his hand and guided him to the curb. He collapsed onto the ground and I stayed with him, assuring him that help was coming. Then I glanced toward the drive-in theater and noticed a pickup truck crashed into a telephone pole. The driver's side window was shattered. We were right on the border of a rough part of town, and I knew exactly what had happened. The police arrived and started questioning us while paramedics rushed the man to the hospital. They kept us there from 2 a.m. until about 6 a.m. Eventually, we learned that someone had shot him through his window while he was driving. It wasn't a random attack. He had been targeted, but they never found out why. The man died from his injuries the next day. The worst part? His killer was never caught. I will never forget the way his face looked or the sound of his voice as he struggled to speak with his shattered jaw. That night still haunts me. Story 25. I've been waiting to talk about this for some time. My father nearly drowning. It happened a couple of summers ago at a local river. We were wading through the water, catching a ton of catfish. The water was low, as it usually is in the summer, making it easy to walk from one side to the other. Catfish like to stay in the deeper holes when the water's low, so we had to walk around one particular hole to cast into it. We were catching them left and right. After about 2 hours, we figured we had enough fish strung up. My dad, thinking he could save time, decided to swim across the hole instead of walking around it. Not his best idea. He was ahead of me, and then suddenly he wasn't. He resurfaced, saying he had dropped his fishing pole. I thought, no big deal. It's just a $60 rod. We can replace it. But then it hit me. He was wearing jeans and lace-up boots. And that's when I realized he was drowning. Something in me switched to survival mode, but not for myself, for him. I didn't hesitate. I dropped my own pole, undid my belt, and swam toward him, about 10 yards away. He was a big guy, around 250 pounds, and keeping him above water was nearly impossible. The hole was just under 10 feet deep, so I made a desperate decision. I went under and started pushing him up from below to get him air. I did it 6 times, but we weren't getting any closer to the edge. Then I decided to grab him by the collar and pull him along. That worked. Maybe 15 seconds later, we reached a shallow area where we could stand. He was exhausted, so was I. Then he told me something that made my stomach drop. There was a hook in his leg, and the fishing line from his drop pole was tangled around him. I reached down, trying to find the line, but I couldn't feel it. So I crouched lower and felt his legs instead. It wasn't the fishing line. It was the stringer with our catfish wrapped around him. The hook he felt was actually one of the fish's sharp fin barbs. I untied the stringer, and those fish were gone. Forget them. We finally made it to shore and just collapsed, crying. We lay there for nearly an hour in shock. It was the most terrifying experience of my life, but I didn't fully process it until it was over. The way he had struggled, the sounds he made, those still haunt me. Watching my father completely helpless like that was unbearable. He threw up a lot of water afterward, but he survived. It was the longest 2 minutes of my life. Story 26. In 3rd grade, my best friend and I were walking home from school. We usually took the path with a crossing guard at the busy street. There was a shorter route, but it had no crossing guard. When we reached the street, he ran ahead and stopped, and then turned around because for some reason I hesitated. Then screeching tires. I saw the car hit him so hard that his body flew straight up into the air, at least 20 feet. He came crashing down with a sickening thud about 6 feet from the car. The jacket he had tied around his waist landed on the hood of the vehicle. The driver immediately got out, dropped to his knees in front of him, and clutched his face, screaming, "Oh God!" Traffic came to a standstill and people rushed to help. I stood frozen for a moment, but then I snapped out of it and ran home as fast as I could, yelling for my mom that Derek had been hit by a car. He survived. He was in a coma for 3 months, and when he woke up, he wasn't the same. He had lasting effects that slowed him down. But we stayed close friends. Story 27. When I was about 8, I was visiting one of my dad's friends who was also a co-worker. The guy didn't have kids my age, but he had a massive backyard that sloped into a large hill, probably about 500 feet tall and covered in trees. To me, it felt like a small mountain. There were trails leading up to the top, along with some water tanks and county pump sheds scattered around. One day I was exploring the hill when I spotted one of the water tanks. It was about 20 feet tall and 40 feet wide. As I got closer, I noticed something lying over the edge of it. At first, I thought it was just some junk, but then I realized it was a person. The body was slumped over the side, and the skin was a strange shade of green and blue. He looked dead. I ran back and told the adults, but they didn't believe me. The next day, they called my parents and admitted I was right. Someone had climbed up there, and ended their life on top of the tank. That image stuck with me for a long time. I had nightmares about it for years. Story 28. I saw the second plane hit the World Trade Center from my office window on the 35th floor, about half a mile away. I didn't hear the first impact because it happened behind me. Someone called me, and I turned to look at the smoke rising in the distance. Papers floated through the air like confetti. I still thought it was just some kind of small plane accident. I couldn't see the hole in the building from my angle. As I watched, I started wondering if it had been caught on video. I pictured the moment of impact in my head, imagining what the crash must have looked like. And then, right in front of me, the second plane appeared. It slid into the building like a coin into a slot. A moment later, a fireball exploded outward in every direction. A few seconds after that, my windows rattled from the force. For 10 full seconds, my brain struggled to process what I had just seen. It looked exactly like the image I had pictured in my head, and for a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Then someone ran into my office asking what had happened, and I heard myself saying it out loud. That's when reality sank in. I walked down 35 flights of stairs, then walked miles home to Brooklyn. I watched the second tower collapse on TV. Eventually, I found my wife and toddler daughter at her gym class. And then for a while, I let myself get lost in my daughter's world, where none of this had happened. Story 29. I watched a man die after a police officer shot him in the head. It happened outside a Tully's Coffee across from my apartment. The guy inside was having a mental breakdown. I first noticed when I heard sirens, then saw him walk out of the cafe, gripping a terrified girl by the neck. He was waving a knife. I watched the standoff from my window for at least 15 minutes. Eventually, it moved out of my line of sight. So, like the bystander I was, I ran downstairs to see what was happening. As I turned the corner, I heard the loudest pop. The man collapsed onto the sidewalk in front of the Rite Aid. His body just crumpled, his face drained of color, going from pink to gray right before my eyes. I had never seen someone die before. It shook me to my core. Whoever was responsible for cleaning up the scene did a terrible job. Days later, there were still spots of blood and brain matter on the pharmacy door. Every time I passed that spot, I thought about him. Story 30. I worked as a patient advocate at a hospital for about 9 months. Our job was to ensure that patients were satisfied with their care, handle complaints and compliments, and assist families during difficult moments. One of my responsibilities was to check on patients in the ER, and we were also required to respond to all emergency codes. When something serious happened, we were the ones who supported the families, essentially acting as grief counselors. Despite only having a bachelor's in psychology, that's why I only lasted 9 months. I saw a lot of people die, but one of my first nights on the job still haunts me. A man in his late 40s or early 50s was rushed in. He had been battling cancer for a while, but something else was happening. I'm not a doctor, so I don't know exactly what, but it seemed like his body was shutting down. Maybe the onset of a heart attack. He was frantic, flailing on the stretcher, making loud, panicked groans. His eyes were wild, darting around the room. Then for a brief moment, he locked eyes with me. I saw his fear. The ER nurses and code team were trying to calm him down, repeating, "Mr. Jones, stay still. Just breathe. Be still." But he kept thrashing, making awful noises. Then suddenly he went silent. Unconscious at that exact moment, his body let go. He evacuated his bowels. I've heard this is common at the time of death, but witnessing it firsthand was surreal. The team immediately started using the defibrillator, the air filled with the sharp commands of clear and the sounds of medical machines. It was overwhelming. I couldn't believe I was watching this unfold. I know for doctors and nurses it's routine, but for me, having never seen someone die before, it was beyond comprehension. Then his daughter rushed through the curtain. That's when I realized my job wasn't just to stand there. I had to be the one to console her. I somehow guided her to the quiet room. Though nothing I said could bring comfort, she was inconsolable. For days I couldn't shake the eerie feeling. Even now, 5 years later, just writing about it makes me feel lightheaded. Story 31. I was 19 when I woke up in agonizing pain at 2 a.m. It felt like I was being stabbed in the side with a butcher knife. I could barely breathe. My boyfriend rushed me to the hospital, which was about 15 minutes away. I was chain smoking, lighting a new cigarette with the last one, because it was the only thing that made breathing even remotely tolerable. As my pain worsened, my boyfriend panicked. He thought I was having a heart attack. He ignored speed limits, just trying to get me there in time. A cop was sitting at a well-known speed trap about a mile from the hospital. When my boyfriend saw the flashing lights behind us, he panicked even more. He thought I was dying. I thought I was dying. He made a split-second decision. Keep driving and explain later. The hospital was on a hill. If you turned right, you entered the emergency entrance. If you turned left, you ended up on the highway. We were almost there. By then, 3 police cars were behind us. One of them clipped the back of our car, forcing us to stop at the bottom of the hill. I was furious at my boyfriend, but also grateful we had made it. I turned to look at him in shock. This nightmare had somehow gotten worse. Then my door opened. I turned around and saw a police officer. His gun was pointed at my forehead. I was doubled over, clutching my side, gasping for air. I could barely speak, barely function. I started crying, begging for my life. Something is wrong with me. I need help. They kept yelling at me. At that moment, I truly thought I had no way out. I was either going to die from whatever was happening inside my body, or I was going to get shot. My boyfriend tried explaining, but they slammed him against the car and arrested him on 7 charges. Meanwhile, a cop grabbed me by the arm and dragged me up the massive hill to the hospital, despite my main complaint being trouble breathing. He gripped me so tightly that I had bruises afterward. I was diagnosed with a pulmonary embolism. If left untreated, it can be fatal. In court, the officer testified that I didn't look sick to him. The judge ruled it was a life-or-death situation and dismissed all charges against my boyfriend, except one. Story 32. My parents took me in as a foster child when I was 4, and they adopted me a couple of years later. They continued to foster kids throughout my childhood, about 70 in total over the years. As you can imagine, having new kids coming and going had both positives and negatives. The experience that terrified me the most happened when I was 13. A foster kid named Jack moved in. He was 17. Every morning he would wake me up by punching me and laughing, full-on body punches. Nothing my parents would notice, because he was too smart for that. He told me that if I ever ratted him out, he would kill me. I believed him. After a few months, he ran away. I was incredibly relieved. A couple of weeks later, I was taking out the trash at night. It was dark, and as I walked behind the garage, I noticed my dad's motorcycle parked there. I was confused because it had snowed that day. Why would my dad ride his bike in the snow and then leave it outside? I went inside and asked him. That's when everything exploded. The cops were called, and we soon discovered that the freezer in the garage had been emptied. Long story short, Jack had moved in just 6 blocks away with some friends. The police found the specific brand of meat wraps from our freezer in their trash, but Jack was already long gone. A few months later, I was watching the late news with my mom. A story came on about a group of men breaking into an old man's house in a town an hour away. They tied him up and robbed him. As they were leaving, one of them told the others to go ahead. He would be right behind them. They walked outside, unaware that he stayed behind and beat the tied-up old man to death. Then Jack's mugshot appeared on the screen. Arrested for murder. I don't know when I was the most scared. When he threatened to kill me. When I found out he had been lurking behind our garage, or when I saw his face on the news. But knowing that he actually followed through on his threats, that he really could have killed me if I had told, has stuck with me to this day. Story 33. A guy I thought was a friend tried to end his life in front of me. He had the whole day planned out. He asked me to drive him up to the mountains. He had me stop to buy a disposable camera. Then he had me drive to one waterfall and then another. The second one had an 80-foot drop. He asked me to take his dog down below and snap a picture of him from below. Immediately after I took the photo, he jumped. The waterfall was fairly dry, but there was a small pool at the bottom, about the size of a coffin, the kind that flares out at the elbows. There was also a ledge about 20 feet down. I ran up to him, thinking he was already dead. My hands were shaking as I called 911, but my phone barely had a signal. 0 bars. Somehow the call went through. All the operator got from me was, "Friend, off cliff," before my phone died. The 911 operators did some heroic-level detective work to figure out who I was and where the call came from. The cell tower that received my call was in a neighboring state, which made it even harder for them to track us down. It took them hours to find us. By the time I saw the silhouette of a head peeking over the top of the cliff, the sun was almost gone. He was airlifted to a hospital far away. He spent over a month there. He had broken all his ribs, punctured both lungs, torn his liver, fractured his pelvis, had part of his wrist jutting through his skin, and cracked his skull. But he lived. This was the same guy who introduced me to meth. In fact, I had been up for days when this happened. My mind was already messed up before, but by the time the cops showed up, I was barely holding on to reality. Story 34. I was playing with a friend at the apartment complex where we lived. The parking lot entrance was on the other end of the complex, about 300 yards away. My friend's dad got on his motorcycle to go somewhere. He pulled out onto the road and accelerated quickly. As he passed by us, he gave a quick beep beep. He made it maybe another 50 feet before he was hit head-on by an oncoming car. His body folded under the front of the vehicle as it skidded to a stop. The car came to a halt right in front of us. I remember seeing his brains. He had been wearing a helmet, but it had been worn down from being dragged along the road. What disturbed me the most was how little blood there was at first. Later in life, I learned that the lack of immediate blood meant his heart had already stopped by the time the car came to a stop. There was a lot of blood eventually, but it didn't gush out. It just pooled. Later that day, I went back to the scene. There was a puddle of blood off the road and flies were everywhere. I was 9 years old. I don't remember my friend's name, or his dad's, but I remember that motorcycle. It was a black and red Honda CB, and it had the word Hawk on it. The car was a 1974 Ford Country Squire station wagon, the same car and color that my own family had. But more than anything, I remember the flies. They weren't regular house flies. They had a metallic green sheen to them. Somehow, the flies disturbed me more than anything else. I knew it was a person's blood they were feeding on, and that was what shocked me the most. I think I was in shock because I don't remember reacting much to the accident itself. The only thing that truly scared me at that moment was the sound of the tires screeching. Story 35. My boyfriend of 7 years sat up in bed and said, "I think I'm having a seizure," before he started convulsing violently. I tried to prop his body up and he started gurgling. It quickly dawned on me that he was vomiting but wasn't opening his mouth. I had never seen a seizure before that night, and it hit me a few milliseconds later that he couldn't open his mouth, so I tried to pry his jaw open, and it felt like minutes. The gurgling continued. At some point, his jaw released and he projectile vomited. I remember feeling a brief moment of relief, maybe 2 seconds. Then I realized he was unconscious. Then I realized he wasn't breathing. This was the first time my hands were free, so I called 911. I have almost no memory of the first part of the call, but I remember vividly when it occurred to me that my boyfriend was dying. Up until this point, he was having a seizure, and I thought, what the F? He doesn't seem like he's breathing? And then suddenly, it was like a punch in the gut. What the F? He really isn't breathing. He's not breathing. And I was just screaming bloody murder at this 911 operator who calmly walked me through chest compressions. To wrap this up, EMS was able to get a pulse, and he spent the next few days in the ICU in a coma on life support while they did tests to determine brain activity. There was none. He was completely brain dead. I held his hand when they pulled life support, and his body stayed alive for a few minutes before he turned green. I guess his tissue was already dying. When he turned green, I bolted. Almost 4 years have passed, and I'm in a place I never thought I'd get to. Happy, in love again. The way I felt in the months after his death was as terrifying as watching him die. I hesitate to say I was suicidal, but there was a period of time when I would have welcomed death. Okay, the end. Who do I make the check out to for today's session? Story 36. I was on a father-son campout for church when I was a kid, late 70s, early 80s, I'm not certain of the year, in a forest in northern Arizona. Yes, they have forests in Arizona. I was showing one of the younger kids how you could take a stick, put it in the fire, and catch the end on fire. It would burn out quickly and leave a glowing ember that you could wave around, kind of making pictures in the dark, an optical illusion. I knew enough to throw the stick into the fire pit once I was done with it. The younger boy didn't. He got called by his dad and, in his rush, threw the stick back into the woods where he had found it. You can probably see where this is going. A forest fire, and essentially my fault. Strangely enough, it didn't really terrify me at the time, but I realize how bad it could have been now that I look back on it years later. The men and older boys formed a bucket brigade and did the best they could until firefighters arrived. I, being one of the older kids not involved in helping with the fire suppression, was tasked with trying to keep some of the younger kids calm as their dads hauled water from the creek. We very well could have all died if the fire had smoldered until we had all gone to bed. At the time, it seemed more surreal than terrifying. I wasn't scared, even though I should have been. Maybe my inner pyromaniac was getting off on it. Maybe I was too young to grasp how bad it could have been. I don't know. I've since seen several firefighters die in forest fires, not personally, but on the news. Story 37. I am Syrian and lived in Syria for quite a long time. Prior to 2012, my neighborhood was a quiet, small place in Damascus, filled with ordinary people working average jobs. Up until that time, I had never heard a gunshot in my life. Then one day war broke out, and it reached our neighborhood suddenly. The small familiar streets I had grown up in were bombed by the Air Force every 30 minutes or so. The sound of a bomb falling and exploding is one of the most terrifying things I have ever heard. At least with airstrikes, you could take cover when you heard the jet buzzing overhead. But when they fired Katyusha rockets, you only heard a loud buzzing sound a few seconds before impact, no time to react. Neither the rebels, who were outsiders using us as shields, nor the government troops, who had strict orders to seal off the area, allowed us to leave. Civilians, regular people just trying to survive, were caught in the crossfire. I will never forget seeing the small market beside my house, the one I had been going to since I was 4 years old, blown to pieces. Bodies of people I had known my whole life lay stacked on top of each other in the streets. It was terrifying, and I wouldn't wish for anyone to experience it. Luckily, I was able to escape with my family by bribing our way out. Story 38. My 16-year-old nephew. His body cold, his lips blue, his mouth slightly open with dried blood around some of his very well cared for teeth. I remember bits and pieces of that day, trapped in a fog of rage and grief. But I can still recall him lying there on the bed at CORE, Center for Organ Recovery and Education. He was covered waist down with a typical hospital tan blanket, a knitted Afghan wrapped around his feet. I wanted to place my hand on his leg, near his ankle, but I hesitated when I noticed that part of his body was severely crushed. I moved to his side and instinctively, I wanted to tousle his blonde hair between my fingers and tell him I loved him. Something I had done since the day he was born. I was the 6th person to ever hold him, but I couldn't. The back of his head was so damaged that they had wrapped most of it in a towel. I helped raise this boy. I knew he wasn't perfect, but he was smart and he had a promising future ahead of him. His death was the result of a series of connected events. If even one thing had happened differently, if one person had been a minute earlier or later, he would still be alive. It was prom season last year. He and his friends were having a party and bonfire in the woods, far from everything. At one end of the road, an accident happened, and the kids heard sirens. Thinking the party was about to be busted, many of them panicked. But my nephew had been coached his whole life never to get in a car with someone who had been drinking. He called his best friend's dad to come pick him up. The dad, however, got blocked by the earlier accident and had to turn around to come from the other direction. My nephew and his best friend started walking down the road, backs to oncoming traffic, heading toward where the dad would be arriving. His best friend's older brother, drunk and high, got into his Jeep Wrangler with 6 other people and started driving. Around a soft turn leading slightly downhill, the Jeep veered off the road by about a foot. And that was it. He hit my nephew and killed him. He died cold, wet, and alone in the middle of the night, surrounded by drunk teenagers. No family, no one who truly loved him.